And what we're going to be looking at is the significance of the Reformation, also the Renaissance. We're going to also look at some of the corruption that was in the Roman Catholic Church predominant at that time. One thing I wanted to say is first of all, I don't in any way intend any kind of disrespect or in talking about some of the moral depravity at this time that was prevalent in the church. And I'm just stating historical fact. I spent time in a Roman Catholic seminary for 3 years, studied world history, including this time period, and I'm not going to say anything about what was going on in the church at that time that they would not have also said. These are just simply facts. Also, I want to say that I'm not an expert either on the subject of the Reformation, but I've been studying it intensely and love this period of time. And I think one of the reasons we're even doing this is I'm hoping that within everybody that does come throughout the day today, and hopefully we'll see more coming in too, that I'm hoping that we can ignite a flame in our own hearts for this history and for what was important to some of these reformers like John Calvin and Martin Luther, etc. One thing I also want to say is when you read history, you get different people's perspectives depending on the author that you read. And I always recommend that you not just read the history, the facts about these people, but that you read some of the things that they actually wrote and get into the heart of who they really are. Because I was, to be frank with you, I was really shocked to hear what different people were saying and to see people from this time period caricatured and then to read their passion and whether their commentaries or their theologies or their letters, sermons, etc. So if you want a clear view of some of these people we'll be talking about, and certainly Martin Luther and John Calvin in particular wrote massively during their lifetimes, and both of them have, if you bring all their works together, fill well over 100 volumes for both Calvin and Luther. So they were very prolific writers. And you get a much clearer idea of what the time period was about and what these people were about. This is probably, the Reformation period is probably one of the most dramatic and significant events in the history of Christianity. Of course, the apostolic age, the life of Christ and the apostolic age was important. The other equally significant, if not even a little bit more significant, actually would be the time of the Council of Nicaea. It was from that time period toward the end of the 3rd century up until around the Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century. Throughout that time period, the church was battling with protecting her doctrine. I know a lot of people get the concept that at the Council of Nicaea in 325, a bunch of bishops all got together and decided to create a religion or to create a Jesus. That's not actually what they were doing at all. What they were doing was saying, how can we protect the doctrine that we hold because so many have risen up against it or have different ideas, and there needs to be clarity about who we are and what it is that we believe. I also wanted to say that I brought several books along as well as have a list of some resources so you can get an idea of some of the things I personally used, and I used other things as well. But just to kind of give you an idea of things, if you want to do further research after today's seminar, if you want to learn more, this is one of the books that I really highly recommend called The European Reformations. I like it because I think he's right in having it as a plural, the European Reformations. And it's more than just one event going on. And it's certainly not a group of angry, revolting Protestant individual sitting around at a table trying to make a new denomination, and that's not what it's about. So why are we even studying this? Well, I think history is really important for every single one of us. We all need to learn the lessons that history has to offer. You know, God reveals himself in real places, in historical events, and through the lives of people. We have a tendency to be pretty short-sighted as to what we're interested in today, and especially in the 21st century. In the late 1990s, there was a survey done in England, and the question was this, one of the questions was this, and who are the two most significant people in the last 1,000 years to you? I mean, from what you know, who are the two most significant people? Well, Princess Diana and Mandela were the two that came at the very top. And when you think about it, well, that would have been maybe over a 40-year period of time, but 1,000 years. And I'm just saying that as an illustration of the fact that we seem to have a very limited view of what's important to us or who's important to us and of history. And I think it's important that we learn history. I see it almost like this. You know, if you want to actually expand your own horizons and learn in life, you want to go and kind of mingle with other cultures if you're able to do that. And you can learn so much from other people, from other cultures. Well, these are people throughout history from other cultures, other parts of the world, in a totally different context than our own. And I think it's really good for us for our thinking and the way we think and what we learn to break out of our own context, and especially if we're bound inside of Western American evangelical television Christianity, to break out of that context and look at the context in other parts of the world as well as throughout history. So I think history is a really important thing. And, you know, also the church has defined itself from the very beginning as one holy Catholic apostolic church. That's how it's defined itself. Well, that doesn't just mean that all the people living today who are Christians are one holy church. That means throughout history we are. So the people that lived during this Reformation period, they're our brothers and sisters in Christ. You know, and they have something to say to us. Sometimes we get the idea that the Holy Spirit deals with us today, but in history past, well, we need to remember he's always been with his church. He's always got things to say. So we can learn from history. I think that's really important. We need to get at the very heart of what the church is all about, and we can see that in a history like this. The only problem is as I was studying this whole time period, the more I studied it, the bigger it got. And I got to the point, and you can ask Vicki, I got to the point where I was just like overwhelmed. There are so many people and so many events, so many things that it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. So maybe someday we can have follow-up where we actually talk about other people. We're not going to have time today to talk about Theodore Beza or Martin Butzer or even Pierre Viret and so on. There's so many others that we could talk about, so many things that they taught or things that occurred, that historical events that we simply won't have time to talk about. We can learn a lot from these reformers. And some of them were just amazingly brilliant minds. And Desiderius Erasmus, for example, had an extraordinarily brilliant mind. The reformers had a saying that they used, and the saying that the reformers used was Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda. Now, doesn't that help? That's Latin. And it simply means the church reformed, always reforming. The church reformed, always reforming. So there is a need for us to learn from them and then look at ourselves and say, what is it that we can do different? There's no way any one of us can look at the time period of Calvin in Geneva and then turn on our television sets and be excited about what's being preached on Christian television. They had such a huge, extraordinary view of providence and sovereignty and the almightiness of God. And today it's all about how I can be a happier man rather than all about the bigness of God. It was a theological movement. These are also, I said, extremely interesting people to study their lives, to study biography, and it can be a lot of fun. Stephen Nichols makes a statement. He says, the things that matter most to us all centers on the gospel. The church simply cannot afford to forget the lessons of the Reformation concerning the utter supremacy of the gospel in everything the church does. The church's true treasure is the gospel. And I want to contend, and we'll talk about this later a little bit, I want to contend that the bottom line for of what the Reformation ultimately was all about is the gospel message. So, one of the biggest causes of the Reformation period, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but as long as everybody's getting themselves coffee, it is coffee. Coffee was the problem. Because at the same time, Erasmus was publishing, putting into print, because a printing press, Erasmus in 1516 published his parallel Greek and Latin New Testament, which was vital to the time of the Reformation. But at the same time, he introduces that to Europe. And now the reformers have, the people of Europe, I should say, have this Greek and a new Latin translation from the original manuscripts rather than from the Latin Vulgate. Arabia introduces coffee to Europe. Same year, 1516. So a little bit of caffeine and a little bit of Greek of the originals, and off it went. So, a couple of things I want to say, too, is when we study history, and in particular this Reformation time period, we need to be very careful not to read our context, our own sentiments, or presuppositions into history. I think we need to engage Scripture and theology the same way, and it's humanly impossible for any of us to totally put aside your own presuppositions because we're just so made up of what we've learned and believe, etc. But we can make a conscious effort to do that, to have an open mind and to study the theology and Scripture, but to also look back at this period of time and to be very careful. The Lutherans of that time, the Calvinists of that time, were not Western Christians, okay? They just, as we are today, 21st century. We need to try to understand the times and the cultures of the people that we study. We need to study to understand their context, okay? We don't want to make plaster images of these people who are simply human beings like everybody else. We also need to try to forget the caricatures of the reformers. Never take an author or teacher's word for granted. Dig for yourself and study. And like I said before, read some of their writings. The word reformation comes from the Latin verb reformo, which means to form again, to mold anew, or to revive. The reformers, and I'm talking mainly about the magisterial reformers. The magisterial reformers were those who continued to have a relationship to the state, to the magistrates, and they weren't as radical. There are radical movements all throughout the time of the Reformation, and what I'm talking about right now are the more magisterial reformers, those who, for example, within the Presbyterian tradition, the Lutheran and the Anglican tradition, rather than like the more extreme Anabaptist movement, which eventually you come out, the Amish and the Mennonites and so on, eventually come out through some of the Anabaptist movements. So I'm talking about the magisterial reformers. They did not see themselves, and this is really important, they did not see themselves as protesters, inventors, or revolutionaries. That's not how they saw themselves. They were not a group of organized revolutionaries. Instead, they saw their efforts as a rediscovery that had a rediscovery of the theology that they thought had become dead at the time of the church. They were not taking something from scratch and making it to be what they wanted it to be. They were reviving what they thought had died. They looked to the Scriptures and to the ancient sources, such as, and especially, the writings of Augustine. Augustine lived from 354 to 430, so that's his context, but they looked especially to his massive volumes of writing. So let's keep that in mind. These weren't a bunch of angry people that thought, boy, I'm going to do my own thing and start my own church. That's not what this is about. It's about, man, we believe we've gotten off center and we need to do something to reform the church. We're discovering the riches of the teachings of the early church fathers. We're going to see in a moment some of the things that influenced that. And we need to do something to reform the church. And Martin Luther himself tried desperately to become a part of a council that was to happen in 1531. The Catholic Church was proposing a council. And he had written up some statements with a desire to go and to be a part of the council, to see what reforms that they could agree on in order to avoid division. And that petition was rejected. Okay, it was really rejected by both sides, though, because they couldn't agree on what they were going to talk about at the thing anyway, so there was too many issues. One of the things, to just look at some history here that impacted the Reformation in a huge way is the Renaissance. And I find this really interesting to see how culture and society is changing for a long period of time. At the time of the 16th century Reformation, there have been significant changes in the way people thought, the passion for the centralization of government and nationalization. And just a couple of things I want to point out here. First of all, I think most of us maybe know what Renaissance means. You do. It's actually a French word, and it means a rebirth. And so Renaissance was an intellectual and cultural movement that roughly spanned the period from the 14th to the 17th century. Beginning first, it's believed in Italy, Florence, Italy, and then later spreading to the rest of Europe. And it impacted a lot. Art, there's a whole study you can do just on Renaissance art. The Renaissance was initially associated with a network of scholars and poets, philosophers, and artists. Many of these scholars were clergymen. It was marked by an explosion in knowledge, creativity, discovery in fields diverse such as history, cosmology, architecture, linguistics, geography, technology, political theory, mathematics. The Renaissance, in its desire to learn, had such a huge impact that in wanting to keep up with what was going on in society at the time, even in Rome, the papacy committed to the intellectual pursuit that was occurring throughout Europe, builds the Vatican Library in 1475, one of the largest libraries in Europe. And it was really the impact of the Renaissance and the passion to learn. Some of the people that lived there in that time, of course, we know in the later part of the Renaissance, right before the Reformation, was Christopher Columbus, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Copernicus. There's a lot of people that lived in that time period that had a big impact in their world. Renaissance scholars, and this is what it's really all about, they were eager to discover the wisdom of ancient civilizations, especially the Greco-Roman world. The term popularized during this period was ad fontes. That's the biggie that you need to remember, ad fontes. And that is Latin, and it means to the sources. The coming out of the medieval age, which was not altogether a dark age, I think that's really a misnomer. There was a lot of good that was going on during that time period as well. But the people coming out of the medieval period felt that, we don't have what the philosophers and scholars had, people like Seneca and Aristotle and so many others. And they had so much more enlightenment than we have. Their Latin is done in a much more beautiful style than ours is. And eventually, when Greek manuscripts come out of Turkey and come over from Constantinople and that whole area and come over into Europe, it's going to ignite that whole idea that much more, because now for the very first time, church people, the clergy, are going to be able to go back to some of the earliest church fathers like Chrysostom, Augustine, and others. So to the sources is really important for the whole period of the Renaissance. They said we want to renew our age by the art of knowledge and writing and etc. So keep that term in mind. Scholars were re-engaging Plato and Cicero, Seneca, and others. Theologians were engaging with the original languages of Scripture. One humanist scholar, Mirandola, in his work on the dignity of man, wrote, "O great and wonderful happiness of man, it is given to him to have that which he desires and to be that which he wills." Otherwise, there's a much bigger expression during the time of the Renaissance of the importance of the individual person, not just the institution. So individualism becomes big, and not always in a negative way, often in a very positive way, and a kind of thinking that will ultimately impact the Reformation when Luther comes along and starts talking about the priesthood of all believers. Everybody has a part in the church to play, not just the clergy. Due to the fall of Constantinople, and I love this, the reason I love this part of history so much is because you can just see so many pieces of the puzzle all falling into place and shaping what will eventually emerge as the 16th century Reformation. It certainly makes you think that none of this that was going on at the Reformation time was just an accident. You see the hand of providence, if you will, in what it will do to liberate people, what it will do to educate people, and enlighten people. So in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Turks, to the Muslim people. What ended up happening is the clergy there, the believers that wanted to run out of Turkey, grabbed their libraries, all that they could get a hold of, and they ran westward into Europe. And under their arms were the writings of Augustine, Chrysostom, the early church fathers, and really, really old Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, something that in the West they did not have. In the West, they had been using Jerome's Latin Vulgate for 1,000 years. So when you see the church's resistance to wanting to translate the Bible into the mother tongue, especially in England, that's a bigger battle, you can understand a little bit about that. Think of how upset people get today when you want to change some of the words in a King James Bible that's been around for 400 years. Can you imagine the Bible that's been the Bible of the church for 1,000 years? So they came into Europe, and there's a time of great enlightenment for the people in Europe. Renaissance scholars began to increasingly use vernacular languages, combined with the invention of the printing press. So at the same time, there's all this incredible enlightenment and new manuscripts, etc. You now have the printing press invented. In fact, that's why there were so many at the time that were trying so hard to find a way to print, because now people had a passion for books. I can remember when I was very young, and most people at the time when I was a real little kid had one television in their house. And I can remember hearing when the neighbors got a second one, it's like, wow, 2 televisions? You know, that's really something. Now we carry them on smartphones in the pocket, you know, I mean, but anyways, at the time, that was big. And I can remember getting our very first colored television as well. You know, it was an amazing thing. Well, people living in the early 1400s, the big thing would have been, I have a book in my house. Yes, a book. Those were still being handwritten at the time, but it became really a status symbol at the time, and socially very important to have books and to have knowledge. That's what the impact of the Renaissance was doing here throughout Europe. And so there were those who were wanting to capitalize on this excitement and this of knowledge and books. And so what did they do? They said, well, we got to make them more readily available. So there was more than just Johannes Gutenberg who was trying to invent a printing press. There were others. In fact, he beat somebody else probably by a matter of months. And so he became the one known as the inventor of the printing press. But if you can only imagine the impact that the printing press had on Europe and on culture at that time. And what it also did is it produced, the time of the Renaissance produced humanist scholars, not to be confused with what we would call today a secular humanism. But humanism was a thought process that was interested in the humanities and in the classics, and is a system as a result of the Renaissance period. Those involved in the humanist movement were devoted to the study of the humanities, the liberal arts, politics, poetry, rhetoric, history, grammar, and literary criticism. Erasmus, that I had mentioned before, born in 1466, he died in 1536. Erasmus was a brilliant scholar, and he studied everything that he could get his hands on. He was known as probably one of the most knowledgeable people of the Renaissance humanists of that time period. And what he did is like I'd mentioned before, he took the Greek manuscripts and he also took the Latin and said, I'm going to make a whole new Latin translation of the New Testament, different than Jerome's, because over time, over the 1,000-year period of time, corruptions had crept into that. And then he took the Greek and he put them side by side. Now the problem with that is the Catholic Church would really come down on him for doing that, because you're challenging the Latin Vulgate. So do you know what Erasmus did, very smart man that he is? He dedicated it to and sent a copy to Pope Leo X. He said, I dedicate this to you. And I think the Pope was flattered, and it became okay for him to have his New Testament. And it is from that many of the reformers, including William Tyndale and who else am I thinking of? Well, Tyndale and, Martin Luther, sorry, would take his Greek and they would make their German and English translations for us. So keep that in mind. It was a time of people having a passion for the classics, a passion for the humanities and liberal arts, and a time of massive study. I would like to just read something from Alistair McGrath. I'm running a little bit back on time, but he did a remarkable job in explaining the impact of the Renaissance period and the humanist scholars throughout the 1400s. What was happening during this time is a lot of the feudal systems were collapsing. At the same time, there were the merchant classes were arising. And I am going to, when I mention later, when I talk about John Huss and John Wycliffe, I will talk a little bit more about the impact that the scriptures had on this merchant class that was rising at the time. So you had a whole merchant class rising. You have a passion for individualism as well as nationalism. And one of the biggest contentions during this time and questions that arises for many reasons is the whole idea of authority. People were beginning to mistrust the church authority. What was happening in the church throughout from 1309, first of all, this is not a bad thing, but from 1309 to 1377, the papacy had moved to Avignon, France. And then from 1378 to 1415, there was a division within the church, and there was some wanting to go back to Italy, and there were two popes. And when the Council of Pisa met in around 1401 to try to resolve the problem of having two popes, what happened is it ends up having a third pope, and they were excommunicating each other. So at the same time, a merchant class is arising. At the same time, people are questioning authority. The church's authority is being mistrusted in a huge way. And this is what Alistair McGrath, British scholar, says. He says the Middle Ages was witness to a massive social upheaval across much of Western Europe. The feudal system gradually crumbled, with wealth and power beginning to shift to a new merchant class. Under the feudal system, power and wealth were concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of families, especially during the 15th century. The influence of the traditional families began eroding. Control of some of the great cities of Europe slipped away from the aristocracy and shifted to the growing number of merchants. These had made their fortunes through trading and dealing and had little time for the old-fashioned attitudes of the traditional families, meaning the aristocracies. Throughout Europe, cities began to be governed by city councils dominated by the new merchant class. Traditional social structures were undermined by greater social mobility, increased wealth and spending power within the middle classes, and a surge in literacy and levels of educational achievement within the population as a whole. This development was immense and had immense significance for the shaping of a new Europe. But let me point something out here, and this author in particular brings it out. This author is Carter Lindbergh. He says, when you have so many changes going on, a new monetary system is beginning to being used. People are beginning to move, and it's kind of like the industrial age that hit the history of this country and Europe. What ends up happening is it also shatters a lot of the things that people had been comfortable with. Whole ways of life were changing, a whole way of doing things. So you also had many people who were being marginalized. You had many people who were really in a state of confusion with a lot of questions and looking for some kind of surety and certainty. It was during this time of the 1400s that there was a huge pietistic movement and the rise of many mystics within the church as they're looking for some true and real connection with God. The control, and I just want to finish up with this article here. The control of sections of society was slowly but surely shifting from the old patrician families to the entrepreneurs. It's during this time that we see capitalism arise in a big way within Europe. The emerging breed of venture capitalists was looking for business opportunities. The great trade fairs of late medieval Europe held at international crossroads such as Geneva became important catalysts for economic growth, encouraging trade across Europe. Investment opportunities were eagerly sought. Our story concerns, this whole story of the Reformation concerns such opportunity like is in the invention of the printing press. The financial backing of the new technology of printing was quickly identified as one of the surest ways to make money. Investments in printing technology became increasingly attractive on account of a major social change, the rise of literacy in people. There's still, by the end of the 1400s, the literacy rate among the population in general was still only about 4 or 5%, but it was increasing greatly. That kind of blows my mind because I grew up in a world where a lot of people, probably at least the majority of the people I knew or had heard of, knew the basic of being able to read. I can't imagine a culture of no books and maybe only 4% of the people being able to read. And once again, you've got the entrepreneurs capitalizing on this in a big way. But you can see how important entrepreneurs were, because what they did is, even though some of them were greedy and sin is in the heart of every human being, and so there's those who corrupted and perverted it all, but on the other hand, it made available to so many people the materials they wanted, the books, etc. It was by the time of the printing press invented in 1455, by the early 1500s, there were hundreds of printing presses all throughout Europe. And in France, when Francis I in the early 1500s was trying to crush the Reformation, in France, one of the problems he had was booksellers were making so much money off of Luther's works, why would they want to stop publishing them? You see, it's the retailers. He says, in the early Middle Ages, literacy was rare and often limited only to the clergy, which is one of the reasons clergy came to have so much control, because they were the educated ones and they were the clerks, and they had a multitudinal other responsibilities. It was common for the courts of Europe to employ clergy to handle their correspondence and archives, and I'm almost done with this. This was not because the clergy might bring some special spiritual quality or blessing to these matters, but simply because the clergy were just about the only people at the time who could read and write. But the new culture of the Italian Renaissance, which swept through much of Western Europe in the 14th century, saw literacy as being a social accomplishment rather than just a useful administrative tool. Being able to read was now seen as the key to personal fulfillment. To own books was a statement of social status, sending out powerful signals concerning both the financial and intellectual standing of the household. Otherwise, if you're anybody, you've got a couple books and you can read. The Renaissance was complex and a highly dynamic movement, which had its origins in, like I said, in 14th century Italy. At one level, it can be seen as a movement working for the renewal of culture, which based itself on the classical language, literature, and arts of ancient Rome. Ancient Rome was seen as a fountainhead, a spring of fresh and flowing water that could refresh and renew European cultures and liberate it from the barren and arid ideas of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance set out to promote written and spoken eloquence and place considerable emphasis on cultivating both reading and writing. To be literate was now more than a technical accomplishment useful for keeping records and correspondence up to date. It was a sophisticated cultural achievement that opened the way to self-improvement and personal fulfillment, not to mention the hope of social advancement. The possession of books was now seen as a social virtue, raising the status of their owner within an increasingly literate culture. This is a time of massive change throughout Europe. And I think that we can see with this, with just the fact of the reading of books and the printing press, how much the face of that world was changing. The reason why Martin Luther was an amazing writer, which I'll get to later, but why were his pamphlets and tracts circulated so rapidly? Because of the printing press and the introduction of rag, cotton, silk paper from the Chinese, actually, into Europe. So they had a whole new kind of paper as well. So all this is all kind of unfolding at the same time. And when we get to John Wycliffe, we're going to see something about the Lollard movement that is going to impact the Renaissance and Europe in the early 1500s in a huge way. But my time for the opening thing is up.
You spoke on culture and impacting how we interpret, and then obviously you're speaking on the Renaissance. What I find funny about the Dark Ages Dark Ages is actually quite interesting. The most rapid technological advancements in agriculture.
Yeah.
So the time that they saved through the invention of brakes and different farming equipment
Yes.
is what allowed people to actually be able to study. So if we wanted to make it, I guess, colloquial, there was a blue-collar revolution in the Dark Ages, a blue-collar progression of technology in the Dark Ages.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's so funny that our culture impacts it so much that the white-collar Renaissance would look at the blue-collar and go, that's dark.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
That's dark.
Yes.
We have a little over 5 minutes to take a break. This will be the shortest break out of them all. And then we'll start with another hymn, and we'll try to start promptly after the hymn.
Okay.